Okay, let me start by introducing myself. My name's Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester. I'd like to welcome you all to the March 18th, 2009 Forest Connect webinar. This is Forest Connect's my overall forest program. There are several of us here that work within Forest Connect, and this is one of the many activities. Let me do a little couple of announcements here, and then I'm going to introduce Kristi. First, we have a new survey process, and at the end of the presentation, as Kristi is taking questions, I will push out a web link to everybody who's currently connected, and they will have access to an online web survey about this presentation. So please take a minute, and it should really just take a minute or two for you to fill it out. Last month there was a just incredible response. It was something on the order of 80% of you responded. I'm trying to remember what I said last month that prompted such a great response. I was talking to Shorna Broussard-Allered in our department, who's a human dimension specialist, and she was amazed at the response. And I told her that you all were very wonderful people, and I'm sure I could count on that same level of response each month. So I hope that you humor me with the time, few minutes it takes to complete that. I'll also probably send out the link to that web survey by email in case you don't receive it for some reason. Some of you will have access to a kind of the hand raising option where you can say yes or no or speak louder or things like that. I would discourage you from doing that. We've had some trouble with that in the past, and it has prevented people from being able to type in the chat pod. So if you want to type a question, just type the question. I think that Kristi is going to be taking questions pretty much throughout her presentation. But you don't need to use any of the hand notification symbols. That's all I have. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Kristi Sullivan. Kristi's a friend and colleague here in the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell, and is very active in the Forest Connect program, as well as some other programs that she's working in. One of her current areas of interest is looking at the effects of climate change on natural resources. And Kristi offered to do this presentation. I thought it sounded like a great option, and I'm delighted now to turn the floor over to Kristi. So Kristi, welcome.
Thank you, Pete. Thanks very much, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad you took the time to join us this afternoon. And as Pete mentioned, I work in the Forest Connect program. I also coordinate the RNOT Conservation and Education program at our teaching and research forest. And my primary areas of interest are wildlife conservation and management, but especially as it pertains to forested habitats. So what I'd like to do today is start out with just an overview of climate change very broadly and some of the things that we can expect to be associated with climate change. And then I want to bring it down to New York State specifically, using New York State as an example of a state within the Northeast, and talk about some expected changes in our weather patterns, and then how that will relate to effects on our forests and wildlife. So basically, I wanted to just provide an overview of climate change and what happens to affect climate change. And this slide just kind of gives a basic overview, that the energy from the sun kind of beats down on the earth, and some of that energy gets reflected into space, and the rest enters the atmosphere. The earth absorbs the energy and emits heat itself, and then we have greenhouse gases that, unlike other gases, absorb and re-emit heat energy as well. So some goes back into the space, and some comes back to Earth. And that heat is effectively kind of trapped in the Earth and contributes to warming. So the initial evidence of changes in our atmosphere as they pertain to carbon dioxide specifically came from some monitoring that started in the 1950s with the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and then was picked up by NOAA later on in the 1970s. And you can see that the levels of carbon dioxide started from the 1950s here, started climbing and climbing and climbing, and have reached record highs in 2005. So that seems like a kind of a short-term span, though, and scientists wanted to get a feel for how that compared to what had been present in the past. So they began to look at carbon dioxide concentrations within the ice core, and they conducted measurements, and those measurements also showed an increasing trend in the amount of carbon dioxide. And then when you get to the 1950s, where the carbon dioxide monitoring had begun, you can see that the patterns fit very well with what was being monitored. In general, I wanted to show you the global trends in major greenhouse gases that we have up to 2003. You can see that carbon dioxide has been on the rise over here over time. Methane has kind of increased and then is flattened off a bit. Nitrous oxide has also been climbing. And then CFCs, which were prohibited a couple decades ago from being included in aerosol cans, have kind of dropped off. So that's some of the good news, that some of these things actually have dropped off, but our carbon dioxide emissions have continued to climb steeply. To give you an idea of what's contributing to our greenhouse gas emissions, I wanted to show you this pie chart that kind of points to our power stations as being probably the major contributor, industrial processes being another large one, transportation fuels, and agricultural byproducts being also the major large ones. For carbon dioxide is a big one here, and it's contributed mostly by power stations and industrial processes, as well as transportation fuels. Our methane emissions are primarily through agricultural processes and byproducts, and somewhat through the retrieval of fossil fuels. And then the nitrous oxide mostly comes from our agricultural byproducts. Chart shows the projected patterns of temperature rise according to several different predictions or models that have been developed to try to predict the changes that will happen in conjunction with climate change. And you can see that while they differ somewhat in the severity, they all kind of follow similar patterns over time. So you can see that the most significant one shows quite a steep rise in temperatures to the effect of about 4 degrees Celsius, whereas the lower model shows an increase in temperature of about 2 degrees Celsius over the next 100 years. I want to use this this picture to show the predicted changes in precipitation over from the 1990 levels to the about 2099. On the left-hand side, that picture depicts predicted changes in the winter months. So you can see here, looking at us in the Northeast, we're projected to have significant increases to the tune of, you can see here the graph showing about 20% increase in precipitation during the winter months. Other areas of the country, the Southwest, for example, is predicted to have significantly less precipitation during the summer months. I'm sorry, that's the winter months. When we look at the summer months, which is over here to the right, you can see that our precipitation may stay the same, it may increase slightly, and where it's not hatched with the little X's across it, that means that there's not an agreement among models in terms of what's going to happen. So for our summer months, we may have an increase in precipitation, but that's not, that's kind of still unknown at this point. In the western part of the state, it looks like there'll be some less precipitation, more dry time during the summer months as well. I want to use this slide, and I do want to acknowledge Rebecca Schneider from our department who works in water resources, and Rebecca's provided a lot of the slides for the the beginning of this presentation and has done a lot of work on water resources and how climate change will affect those resources. This slide just depicts basically the warming in high latitudes. This is Greenland, and it shows the loss of the ice caps over time. And there's been a more significant loss of the ice at the ice caps than scientists previously expected. And they believe that because even though a certain extent of the ice cap is covered, there's less older ice that's deeper, and so it's very shallow ice that remains that's covering that land area. So they expect that it'll kind of be accelerated because of that. Here's a slide that I think is very powerful that Rebecca put together. It kind of shows an area in Bolivia where they have a significant glacier, the runoff from which feeds a lot of streams that are downhill and provides a lot of drinking water supply for much of the population. You can see in 1940, up in the left here, if you look at this area, it was almost completely covered by the glacier. That it shrunk somewhat from 1940 to 1982. It shrunk considerably between 1982 and 1996. And you can see that here in 2005, I believe that says, you can see that there's very little of this glacier left. And that's kind of parallels what's happening in other countries, including Asia. A lot of areas where melting of the glaciers and annual runoff is very important to feed major rivers like the Yangtze and others, and again, provide very important water sources. Just to bring it home to New York State a bit, again, there have been different models that have been developed to predict climate change. Two very common ones that are referred to is one that has a high emissions scenario and one that has a lower emissions scenario. And those are based on what we might contribute to the atmosphere in terms of carbon dioxide in the future, whether it's a higher level or a lower level of emissions. So you can see that for using New York State as an example, we're here right now. Our average temperature already has gone up nearly 2 degrees Fahrenheit in over a 30-year time period. Our winter average temperatures have warmed faster, about 5 degrees Fahrenheit over a 30-year period. So we've had significantly more warming during the winter months than we have during the summer months. According to the low emission scenario, you can see that New York, under the low emission scenario, moves down by 2010 to 2039 to climate similar to that of Pennsylvania. Between 2040 and 2069, New York's weather would look a little bit more similar to West Virginia, and you can see 2070 to 2099, it would be moving even further south. Under the higher emission scenario, New York State would feel like Alabama and Georgia by 2099. We have a question here from Tom. The temperature prediction graph appears to depict the modeling from around 2000. Any data on how trends since then compare with the model prediction? I'm sure there are, and I don't have access to them. I haven't seen any, but I'm certain there probably are newer how our temperatures are fitting currently. Any pictures of the glacier from this year? That's a really good question, Williams. I don't have any. I'm sure if Rebecca had them, she would have included them. But these days we have Google Earth, and if you wanted to look up that glacier, you might be able to check it out just using Google Earth and get a picture of how it looks today. For New York State, we're predicted to have fewer days with snow cover as time goes on. And this is relative to the number of days we've had with snow cover between 1971 and 2000. So relative to that period of time, you can see that the areas with large circles, so here in central New York and western New York, we are predicted to have a 30-day decrease in the number of days that we have snow on the ground, and a little less significant for places like New Jersey, and it seems to be kind of scattered around in terms of who's going to see the greatest reduction of snow cover. But reduced snow cover or loss of snowpack and early snowmelt is going to have some effects on tourism from skiing and ice fishing, things like that. It's going to contribute to lake and stream warming, could cause degraded fisheries, and also could increase the number of incidences of waterborne disease. These graphs here show an increase in precipitation intensity that may be expected under the predictive models, and also the number of days that have maximum amounts of precipitation within a 5-day period. Basically, even though we will either be having the same amount of rainfall or an increased amount of rainfall in this area, that rainfall is predicted to come in a fewer number of heavier events. So we will have fewer days with rain, but the intensity of that rain, especially those days when we get more than 2 inches of rain within a 24-hour period, are projected to increase. Well, Spencer has a really good question here. Does no snow result in a change of heat? And I'm not sure if I'm interpreting your question properly, but basically, if you don't have snow cover, that can actually increase the amount of heat that's absorbed from the sun instead of being reflected back because of the light color, the brightness of the snow. So actually, yes, less snow cover means an even greater increase in the amount of heat that's retained. Right, I threw this in just to kind of put some of this in context. So, with those an increasing number of heavy rainfall events, we would expect to have an increased number of flooding events, especially because if you go for some dry periods for a while and the ground is hard, and then you have a heavy rainfall event, much more of that water you would expect to run off the soil surface rather than be absorbed into the soil. And then again, just because of the amount of rain that you're getting at once, you would expect more runoff. So here for New York State, I threw in this graph of basically flood events per county between 1994 and 2006. You can see that Delaware and Sullivan County have had 6 or 7 flood events during that time period. Some of our southern tier counties have also increased additional flooding. And in New York State, flood damage in 2006 alone exceeded $54 million. So it's become already significantly in an economic sense. So the economic models that have been put into place suggest that even a 13.5% increase in annual precipitation could increase future flood damage by about 140%. And here are just 2 examples of flooding that have occurred in New York State. To the right, you see that when you have more flooding events, this is an example of a farm field where manure had been recently spread. So there's heavy rains, and a lot of that manure is washed off the field, so it's not kept there where it's needed, and it's also washed off into our ditches, which then carry the manure downstream and sometimes enters our water sources. Here's a picture on the left where a culvert was too small to handle the amount of flooding that was taking place in the stream, and Rebecca actually has a video of this happening, and it just starts to slowly come up and around the culvert, and then after a while the road kind of breaks up and becomes. In addition to extra flooding events, we could expect an increase in the number of droughts that we have in the northeastern United States. I wanted to show here in this slide that the number of short-term droughts, those being 1 to 3 months in length, are predicted to increase. this is what we currently see today. Under the lower emission scenario, you can see that that would increase significantly right here in the northern part of New York State. And under a higher emission scenario, the entire area around here would see about 30 events. I think that's annually. In a year within of short-term 1 to 3 month long droughts. And here's another picture just depicting the same for 3 to 6 droughts that last 3 to 6 months. Again, especially under higher emission scenario, you'd see a significant increase in the number of those events. And the same for long-term droughts, which are droughts that last for more than 6 months. Threw this picture in for all you ice fishermen out there. It shows that lake ice out over time has come earlier and earlier. So that can shorten our number of ice fishing days. And overall, just to put it in a larger context, over time there's going to be greater political and economic pressure for interbasin water transfers to water-stressed regions, not only of our own country, but also internationally. So when the West is experiencing droughts, California currently is in the midst of a very severe drought. Where are they going to get their water from? We live in a very water-rich area here in New York State, and being close to the Great Lakes Basin, which contains 95% of the fresh surface waters in all of North America and 20% of the fresh water globally. There'll be a lot more pressure on this region of the world to be providing water to other areas, and that'll will create new and increasing demands for the water that we have here. Okay, so change. Now I'm going to talk about our forests and wildlife, and just wanted to mention that change has already been happening and has been documented over the years. Things like warmer springs leading to earlier nesting for 28 of our migrating bird species on the East Coast. In New York State, over a 90-year period, 39 migratory bird species arrived significantly earlier. 35 have shown no significant changes, and only 2 species are arriving later in the spring, according to a recent research paper. Between 1959 and 1991, tree swallows have been found to be breeding and laying eggs 5 to 9 days earlier than they used to. Some other changes in Canada, red foxes have expanded northward, and that's led to the retreat of Arctic foxes. In northern Canada, red squirrels are breeding 18 days earlier than they did just 10 years ago. Several frog species now initiate breeding calls about 10 to 13 days earlier than they did a century ago in New York State. That research was conducted by Al Breisch and some others. And those species are the spring peeper, the wood frog, the gray tree frog, and the bullfrog. In addition, for about 6 of 15 wildflower species with available data, blooming is occurring 20 days earlier over a 50-year period, and there are no species that are flowering significantly later. So how will our forests be impacted overall by these changes? And I wanted to categorize it into 3 main sections here. One is the change in native species composition that we can expect. The second is the spread of invasive species that may happen concurrently. And then the third is changes in phenology. And phenology is just the biological timing that happens in response to environmental conditions. So it could be when plants flower, or when birds initiate calling in the spring for the breeding season, those types of things. Overall, higher temperatures, an increase in ozone, frequent flooding, and more frequent droughts is predicted to have an effect on the health and productivity of our forests and our native communities in general. For plants as well as animals, species ranges are expected to extend northward and also up in elevation. So as temperatures rise, as you would expect, you'd expect species to move follow that trend, moving toward the cooler temperatures, which would be more northerly and higher in elevation. I wanted to show what our, in a very broad scale, what our forest types are currently, and what's predicted to happen to the ideal habitat for those forest types uh, with, um, with increased temperatures. So this first graph here on the left shows what we currently have. And using New York State as an example, you can see that we mostly have maple, beech, birch forest, and that's, again, very broad, with an area here uh, over in the Lake Plains of elm, ash, and cottonwood, and some small inclusions of spruce fir forest. And again, this is very obviously very broad. The rest of the maps are just different models, again, with different predictions, and they vary somewhat in what they're predicting, but you can see, again, that there's a general trend toward a loss of maple, birch, and beech, and an increase in oak hickory. So the dark green is oak hickory, and then even over here in this model, the light green is oak and pine. So you can see that the optimal range for the habitat types for these forest types is moving about 100 to 300 miles north by 2100. And then just a little more specifically, there are some species of trees that are predicted to be the losers under this scenario and some that are predicted to be the winners. And the species that I have highlighted in red are species that are currently our dominant species in New York State. So you can see that species like our maples, white ash, which is going to experience greater problems due to emerald ash borer probably before climate change affects it, yellow birch, eastern hemlock, eastern white pine, American beech, and black cherry are all significant components of New York forests that are affected to be negatively impacted by changes in temperature due to climate change. Quaking aspen, black ash, balsam fir, and red spruce also are expected to be impacted significantly. These are species that aren't major dominant species in New York State, but because they aren't, there's less of them, they are expected to lose most of their current habitat under the predicted scenarios, whereas the species that are the more dominant species will become less common in our forests, but won't necessarily be eliminated. The winners, as you can see over in the right-hand column, are things like oaks and yellow poplar, sassafras, eastern red cedar. They predict maybe more hackberry and honey locust, red mulberry, shortleaf pine. Things like common persimmon and winged elm might be the winners. And the only species in the winners column that is currently a dominant species in New York State is northern red oak. So the wild card with all this is that the graphs that I showed you are predicted changes in the optimal habitat. But just because the optimal habitat is there doesn't mean that the tree species will actually make it there. Plants and trees disperse very slowly over time, and the actual species that are going to make up our forests will depend on other factors. Is the soil type appropriate in addition to the weather conditions? Are there adequate migratory pathways for those species to actually expand their distribution northward, or will there be development and other things in the way that kind of prohibit the dispersal of those seeds? What about other seed dispersal mechanisms? Things like the species that maybe a certain tree depends on for dispersal, things like the blue jay and acorns. What about competition with other species and the availability of the insects and whatnot that pollinate those trees and plants? Will they also move northward at the same rate? In addition to the change in habitat suitability, invasive species are expected to increase as our climate changes. Most of these species have a very broad climatic tolerance. They have lightweight seeds and they're very prolific. They take only a short time till they mature, and they compete with native species. Purple loosestrife produces thousands of seeds in 1 year, and they can stay viable for, I believe it's for a very long time underwater. So these species tend to be more generalist in nature and seem to respond very well to disturbance. So invasive plants are going to become even more of an issue over time. Invasive insects might become a greater issue as well. I wanted to use the hemlock woolly adelgid as an example. The hemlock woolly adelgid was just found in Tompkins County for the first time this year. That's where we are here at Cornell. And just within the past month has been found in several natural areas, Cornell Plantation's natural areas. So it's expanding its range both northward and inland. The hemlock woolly adelgid typically causes some fairly significant mortality depending on the area of the country for hemlocks, and this has some effects on other species as well, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So here's a graph of hemlock woolly adelgid infestations that occurred between 1951 to 2002. You can see it kind of spreading inward and spreading inland. And then this graph shows, I believe as of, this must be 2006 or 2007 here, it's expanded even further. And if we were to look at it today, I know there's a pocket here in the Finger Lakes area. There's a section, I believe it's over here in Potter County in Pennsylvania. And so it continues to spread. And one thing that limited the ability of hemlock woolly adelgid to spread in the past was the colder winter temperatures. The adelgid doesn't do very well, or hasn't in the past, in areas that have cold winter temperatures, and very specifically below average or very cold January temperatures. So the warmer winters have allowed this species to expand. The phenology was another issue that I mentioned, and that's basically just that plant and animal interactions, things like pollination and seed dispersal, really depend on synchrony between species. So if a bird is migrating earlier and kind of in response to climate change, but when they get there and nest and their young are born, the insects that they feed on are not, haven't also changed as well. They may be kind of out of synchrony, and that could lead to, loss of food source for that species. And so for a variety of different ecological interactions, this kind of decoupling could have really serious impacts. And a lot of that's very difficult to predict. We don't really have the knowledge required, and there are a lot of different interactions among species. So I want to move on now to wildlife and wildlife habitat and talk a little about how that might be impacted. And again, under three headings, one being habitat change, another being effects on the various groups of wildlife using specific species as an example, and lastly, the effects on ecosystem processes overall. So in the Northeast, the habitats at greatest risk are considered to be high altitude habitats like our spruce fir forests, habitats that already are somewhat isolated in smaller patches and are already under some stress because they may, be in small pockets and maybe at the northern, at the southern edge of their range. Wetlands, because of the changes in flooding and drought and the changes in the hydro period that could occur. Low-lying coastal areas near the oceans and our coastal habitats, especially for species like waterfowl, and our lakeshore habitats as well. So like plants, species ranges of wildlife are expected to extend northward and already have been up in elevation and up in elevation. An increased abundance is expected for some. Some will decrease in abundance, and some may be completely lost from a given area. A study of 150 common bird species showed that at least we're having at least a 25% change in the occurrence of bird species in the Northeast. To use an example from the New York State Breeding Bird Atlas. From 1980 to 2005, the range of many species was shown to be extended northward. More northerly species ranges also contracted at the southern edge of their ranges, as well. So not only were they moving north, but their the southern end was moving northward as well. And this happened across habitats and regardless of the food preference for bird species. So no matter what habitat they prefer and no matter what types of food they eat, whether it be insects or seeds, it was still happening kind of across the board. The Nashville warbler moved northward, to use a specific example, and the Carolina wren, there's the southern edge of its range, moved northward. Some birds, things like the Bicknell thrush, pictured here, will be significantly impacted. They prefer spruce fir forests. The higher elevations of their habitat will result in a loss of that habitat, and the patches that are left will become increasingly isolated, making it difficult for these birds to thrive. I'm going to give you some examples just from our common and more popular bird species. The ruffed grouse really is a northern species. The grouse does very well in cold climates, especially where there's snow. Grouse like to roost in hemlocks. They like to burrow under the snow in the winter time. The snow kind of provides a layer of insulation above them. And in winters where you have significant icing or not very much snow, the grouse can actually get trapped under the ice coating that forms over the snow, or they don't have those areas to the snow to kind of burrow down into and be isolated from the below freezing temperatures. So you can see that the model on the left shows the yellow areas being ideal ruffed grouse habitat currently, and as you move to an increase in temperature predicted by some of the models, you can see that grouse's preferred habitat moving more northward, so that the preferred habitat for the grouse in New York State becomes really limited to mostly just the Adirondacks. I wanted to throw in an example of something positive here, and so here's the ruby-throated hummingbird. You can see that currently in New York State anyway, there's this area of red. That means it's not such great habitat for the hummingbird. Yellow is ideal habitat, and you can see here that the ruby-throated hummingbird would be expected to actually do better under the predicted conditions. The black-capped chickadee too is a species, a more northern species that's common that we would expect to not do well, kind of similar to the ruffed grouse. In terms of our freshwater fish, the species that will be most vulnerable will be our cold water species as water temperatures increase. Trout and salmon populations may be reduced by about 50% or more, and many trout species throughout the Northeast already have some vulnerabilities, and this will only increase the issues with providing habitat that's ideal for trout. An example for amphibians is that amphibians generally are tied to temperature and moisture. They have nothing really to protect them from drying out or desiccation, except to be in that type of ideal habitat that's either wet or in the forest, very moist soils, those types of situations. And they also have low dispersal ability, so they can't, unlike birds, which are already responding to climate change and seem to be doing fairly well in terms of being able to continually adapt. Amphibians really have a much lower dispersal ability. Certainly not as low as plants, but they would be expected to have a more difficult time groups. Amphibians already, as I mentioned before, are trending toward earlier breeding. And for some amphibians, if they breed too early, they may be more vulnerable to things like snowmelt-induced floods and early freezes that are usually less common later in the season. And we could use things like the spotted salamander or wood frog as an example. Those are species that are the first to move to their breeding pools from the forest to their breeding pools sometimes in March or April. If they're induced to come out too early by a nice warm rain, and then there are very hard freezes shortly after, that could be a problem for them. One of the possible benefits might be that warmer temperatures during the early summertime might actually shorten the time needed for the salamander and frog larvae to grow in their breeding pools, and could have some benefits in terms of them being able to grow faster and move out onto the landscape sooner. For an example of reptiles, I wanted to use the painted turtle, and I don't know how much everybody knows about turtles, but they have something that I find really fascinating, which is temperature-dependent sex determination, so that their eggs, once they're laid, will develop either into males or into females, depending upon the temperature that that their surrounding habitat experiences while they're developing. So for the painted turtle, if the temperatures are warmer, you'd expect to have more females, and cooler, you'd expect to have more males. So you can see that if the temperatures got too warm, it would bias the populations toward females, and you would have fewer and fewer males, and that could become an issue for the populations overall. One potential benefit might be that the hatchlings might grow faster during the warmer summer, similar to amphibian larvae. And so that, the faster you can grow as a small turtle, the sooner you get to a size that you're no longer as appetizing to predators. So that's then another drawback is that sometimes the hatchlings overwinter below ground, and if snow cover is low, again similar to the grouse, snow cover prevents the soil from freezing and kind of insulates it. So if snow cover is low, you could have more freezing of hatchlings. Big game, cold temperatures are currently a barrier that limits the spread of diseases, and warmer temperatures could lead to an expansion in the range of disease-carrying insects like ticks and midges, and it could accelerate the impact of diseases like EHD, or epizootic hemorrhagic disease, and West Nile virus. And of course, Pennsylvania and New York have already experienced an increase in the number of incidences of EHD. I believe that in New York, EHD was never found prior to 2006 and has been found for the last couple of years here. So in terms of diseases, we'd expect to have an increase in the number of diseases that not only affect wildlife specifically, but that become more of a threat to humans as a result of the diseases' interactions with wildlife and people. So an example of that is Lyme disease. Ticks are expanding their range as a result of warming, and that has potential to spread Lyme disease to additional areas. Some other mammals that could be affected significantly are things like bats, not only through the change in insect availability. If you have more drier, droughty conditions during the growing season, during the summer months when bats are feeding their young and feeding themselves, then there actually might be fewer insects that are hatching at those times, and that could lead to a shortage of food for these animals. In addition to that, when bats hibernate, lower temperatures while they're hibernating can cause them to awaken. And every time they awaken, they use a considerable amount of their fat stores. So if they wake up too often during the winter, then they can actually have increased energy demands during hibernation. They may run out of fat stores and they may not survive winter. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but basically that warmer winter temperatures could have a very negative effect on these species that are very adapted to cold conditions. There's some potential impacts to things like our hunting seasons and what we experience during hunting. For example, waterfowl. Some waterfowl species are already migrating later in the fall. Their routes may change, and they may experience habitat loss. Like I mentioned before, coastal areas and some of our wetlands may become less suitable. Things like the changes in timing of the rut or other breeding seasons for for example, might necessitate more of a more adaptive management and more flexibility in the changes of our seasons and whatnot. Then in terms of phenology, I just wanted to mention once again that just like for plants, for wildlife, differences in responses of species to seasonality can lead to a decoupling of, for example, bird migration with the availability of essential food sources. And if closely interacting species become out of phase, then processes like pollination, seed dispersal, and insect controls can be disrupted. So to summarize, for wildlife, range shifts are likely to depend on availability of migration corridors, on the availability of suitable habitats, and a concurrent movement of both forage and prey to these areas. And it may be complicated by other landscape changes and pressures that we've already put on the landscape, things like roads and cities and habitat fragmentation that kind of have a twofold effect. One is that it makes it more difficult for species to disperse, and more specifically trees and plants, but also that fragmentation and increased disturbances also have uh, the effect of kind of aiding the dispersal and the spread of invasive species. And so it could not only prevent the dispersal of species, but also increase the amount of competition from non-native invasive species. I wanted to take a look at hemlock, just to use hemlock as a case study of how complex these interactions could be, and the difficulty in trying to predict all of the effects that could occur. And so you just want to look up here. Climate change specifically is predicted to have a negative impact on the tree species of hemlock because of the change in habitat. Uh, at the same time, it's supposed to have a positive impact on the hemlock woolly adelgid, which in turn has a negative impact on hemlock. Hemlock is really a keystone species in our forests. It's the major dominant conifer in our forests. Um, it often grows in dense stands along our stream banks. There are a number of bird species, things like the Blackburnian warbler, the Acadian flycatcher, and the hermit thrush that are very strongly associated with intact hemlock stands. So those species could be very significantly impacted by the loss of hemlock along our streams and other areas. At the same time, hemlock provides shading over many of our cold water headwater streams that support trout, and so the loss of hemlock along our stream banks could increase the warming of the water and could also lead to significant erosion and sedimentation in the water, which would have very negative effects on these animals. And then just in terms of water quality overall, that the loss of hemlocks along our streams could lead to significant erosion and water quality issues. So just to show how complex and how interwoven everything is, and the complex nature of climate change and the impacts that are happening and could happen in the future. Okay, what can we do about all this? What are some things that we can do as landowners or land managers to help kind of offset or kind of hedge our bets against the impacts of climate change? Well, the first is really to keep doing whatever we would have done despite climate change that leads to the sustainable management of our forests and good forest stewardship. Things like maintaining stream and wetland health, so maintaining riparian areas, protecting our seasonal pools and other wetlands. Around our homes, we can use rain gardens and rain barrels and low-lying depressions to try to capture rain that comes from our rooftops during heavy rain events and save it for the droughty summer months. So basically just trying to retain water, keep water on the landscape for as long as we can to try to help offset the highs and lows that may occur. And maintaining healthy connected habitats that aren't fragmented is going to help to reduce some of the pressures, the additional pressure that might be happening on our landscapes, and allow for increased dispersal and maybe less expansion of invasive species. You can see here in this picture it's kind of become an isolated section of habitat, and you can imagine that none of the species that that live in an area like this would have a very good chance at dispersing given the surrounding conditions. So when it comes to land use planning and those types of things, we can kind of take climate change into consideration in terms of future planning. And also, everybody's kind of trying to increase and encourage the monitoring of existing species and habitat conditions. The sooner that we can detect changes, the sooner that we can predict and try to adapt to what's going to happen as a result of that. And so, especially when it comes to pest species and new pest species, it's very important to monitor for that and also report it. We can aggressively manage pest outbreaks that occur, and we can manage for species and age diversity both within our forest stands and at a landscape level. That kind of falls under the heading of hedging your bets. We can encourage sustainable forestry practices. So as I said before, just kind of doing what we would have done naturally anyway. Avoiding high grading and just encouraging those sustainable forestry practices. Having long-term forest stewardship planning for our lands, and best management practices, putting them in place becomes even more significant now and even more necessary, and could. And so with that, I'm finished here, and I'd like to take any questions that you might have. I see we have a question over here. It's kind of long. Tom asked.
Kristi, while you're reading that to yourself and thinking, I just want to say thank you. And to alert everyone, I'm going to be pushing out the online survey. This will open in your existing internet browser. Unless you have pop-up blocker in place, you shouldn't have to do anything. I'm only going to push it out once, because if I push it out twice, it clears the responses from people who have started responding. So here it comes.
Okay, thank you.
Cross your fingers. Okay, you may have to click back to the screen. For me, it took me to that other window. Okay, Kristi, thank you. Let's go ahead and you all can start typing in questions for Kristi. She can start responding.
Okay, yeah. I'm still reading Tom. It was kind of coming and going here. So Tom, you're asking, and if I'm not interpreting your question correctly, then please let me know. But in general, I think that current recommendations are to try to encourage maintaining large areas of habitat, and especially either maintaining the connectivity of those habitats, or actually, kind of thinking outside the box in terms of ways that we can reconnect those habitats. And yeah, maybe some level of protection to try to facilitate that, so that species can naturally disperse and make that northward movement. Does stimulus money take climate change and forest issues seriously? That is a very good question that we have had right here in-house as a result of a workshop we participated in last week. The fact that there's a lot of opportunity, if you're replacing infrastructure, to plan ahead for additional things like flooding events, and to implement new culvert size recommendations, and recommend larger culvert sizes as part of permitting processes, and just small steps like that, as well as some other much larger steps. I really think, and so the answer is we don't know, and that's something that we've here in-house said, we should take a look at that and see if there's any effort being put forth to consider climate change when these activities are, these monies are being spent, and when they take place. And maybe a good time to reach out to government agencies and ask those questions and kind of stimulate that in their thinking. As far as forestry issues, I don't know that either, and it seems like now would be a good time to provide some incentives for landowners to kind of maintain their properties, but I'm not sure if anybody's really thinking along those lines. My information on specific wildlife species has come from many different scientific publications that I've found, and if you do a search for climate change and wildlife in Google Scholar, you'll find a whole lot of different papers. And there are a lot of resources out there, and those resources are growing every day. And I'm sure that you'll be able to find some some details that are specific to Ohio. I think that the Nature Conservancy is working on some more local models, so trying to bring it down to a more localized level, like a state kind of level, looking at the predictions for climate change specifically at a smaller local level, so that people can get a better feel for in their local area, what changes they would expect, instead of looking at a whole big national or northeast. So I know that's in the works, and I don't know that it'll be out for maybe another year or so, but that is something. It seems that both plant and animal species may need some assistance in migration. This is something that's being debated currently, that it's called assisted migration. It's somewhat contentious, and there are a variety of different opinions on whether that should take place or not. And so, yes, it's definitely being discussed. I believe the Forest Service has some climate change information on their website, and this is mentioned as something that's being debated and considered. The question about hemlock and eastern white pine being lost in Pennsylvania and what species to plant in riparian buffer zones. That's a really good question, Susan. I am not sure what would be a good substitute for those species. Um, I can't even, I won't even attempt that one. And because I just don't know enough about what other species might replace those. Certainly not native species, currently here, um, because I believe they might already be there. But Pete, if you know anything, if you have any suggestions.
Well, the only, I think in terms of the white pine replacement, I would look to other pines, more southern pines that might be coming in. Um, I'm not sure. I mean, you'd want probably, it depends on what you want for that kind of ecosystem function. For the hemlock replacement, that's perhaps more challenging and restrictive because there are, at least in New York, hemlock serves such an important role as a shade tolerant species. And the other two shade tolerant conifers are, off the top of my head, are native are balsam fir and red spruce. So balsam fir is highly susceptible to deer damage, so that doesn't seem like a good option. And red spruce, from the climate models, doesn't look like that's going to be faring much better. So um, that's a big, I don't know if so other kinds of spruces that would grow in those conditions would be things like Norway spruce, which is of course an introduced species. So it's a little, that's I don't, I'm with Kristi. I don't have a good recommendation.
Let's see. Winnie asked about how to effectively engage naysayers to climate change. And I'll only say there that we as a group here in Natural Resources have a grant to do some work and produce some educational materials, and to hopefully help to educate people about what's anticipated. So we do have some projects that are just gearing up right now, and the results of those will hopefully be in within a couple of years. We'll be having several workshops, but at this point we're kind of focusing on natural resource managers first, to get a feel for what they feel the most significant changes will be and what tools they're going to need to be able to manage. But presentations like this one and others we'll be working on as well. The high elevation and wetland systems being more susceptible to climate change, that's mostly because the high elevation habitats contain species like balsam fir and red spruce that are very northern. They're northern species, and they're already being stressed. And so they're already at small patches at high elevations or northerly locations. They basically can't go up any higher in elevation to respond to climate change. And so, those species that are already kind of stressed are going to be more susceptible to increased stress from. In terms of wetlands, I mentioned wetlands mostly because with the increased number of floods and droughts, that could affect wetlands more significantly. And then we have changes in the hydrology of wetlands. It can alter the plant species composition. It can make it easier for invasive species to move in. Sea level rise and whatnot. There'll be increase in intense precipitation events and hurricanes and whatnot along the coast. Be quite a few changes there. And I think that Lake Erie, I'm not sure it was Lake Ontario, I think it was Lake Erie, has already dropped like 15. Oh, no, that's the sea level in New York Harbor is 15 inches higher today than it was in 1850. But I know that the lake levels in Lake Erie have dropped significantly, and I don't have the exact number. Let's see. I think it was in the chart. Over the past 10 years in New York State, I'm not quite positive. I can go back and look at that at the end after I try to. Oh, there you go. Thanks for the response of 2 degrees. The American Chestnut Foundation breeding program is breeding chestnuts with blight-resistant trees of Virginia. I really don't know what the question is. That I don't know that I have the expertise to be able to predict what's going to happen with those trees that come from the rootstock of 1930, and if it's going to be from too cold a habitat, and where they'd be better suited. My personal take on climate change. Well, I guess I personally feel that climate change does. There are certainly natural cycles, but I think that there's a lot of good evidence, and it's global. It's not just local. Especially the ice core data that I showed in the beginning, that kind of shows that there's been a significant increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since as a result of human activity. Yes, Carla, the presentations are all on the webinar website. They are all available for you to look at your leisure in the future. There you go. Pete just put it up, forestconnect.info. You can find that this and other previous presentations on the website. Thank you, Casey.
Well, I want to thank Kristi for a fabulous presentation. Very insightful and covered a lot of ground. And if you would like to review or re-review, whatever, review I guess is the right phrase. This will be the recorded version will be posted to the Forest Connect site. Just click on the web conferences. I'll be sending out the online survey by email. There's also a couple of other websites, one a U.S. Forest Service Fish and Wildlife Climate Change website, and a Society of American Foresters publication on climate change that we'll be sending out. So thank you all very much for participating. You all were fortunate to arrive a few minutes early. There were a dozen or so people that tried to arrive right at noon, and they didn't get in. So glad you could join us, and for those of you that couldn't join us, we'll be back here live again at 7 o'clock tonight. So have a great afternoon, enjoy spring, and don't forget about April 15th, Ralph Nyland's webinar on rehabilitating cutover stands. So Thanks, Kristi. You all have a great
Thank,
day.
thanks, Pete, and thanks to all of you.